Political prosecution is well underway here in Ottawa. The longest mischief trial in Canadian history, the trial of Freedom Convoy organizers Tamara, Lich and Chris Barber, sentencing hearing day one today. And for the first time in this epically long trial, more than 45 days of trial time, I've been there reporting for the vast majority of it. For the first time throughout this whole thing, things moved really well today. We got through the Crown's opening submission, the Crown's submissions. We got through Diane Magas' submissions for Chris Barber, and now tomorrow, Mr. Greenspun is telling us that he thinks he can finish his submissions for Tamara Lich by noon. Then the Crown is going to respond and go through the motions. I made a summary video at lunchtime talking about what we saw this morning, and the Crown did their typical bloviating, said that the convoy caused excessive or incredible harm to the people of Ottawa, and that it was Chris and Tamara who did that, and that there needs to be a severe sentence, and that they're not seeking the 7 years for Tamara Lich and the 8 years for Chris Barber lightly. That's the proportionate sentence. Now, we all know that that's not true. Any reasonable person looking at this through an objective lens knows that that's not a reasonable sentence. And it's a ridiculous situation that our country finds itself in, and it's very appropriate and very fortunate that a few days ago, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, and other Conservative MPs who are sitting, because Pierre is running for his by-election, he lost in Ottawa, which I think, by the way, is a secret blessing for our country, but we'll talk about that another time. We had all kinds of Conservative MPs come out. Andrew Lawton, who covered this case extensively when he was not in Parliament, he came out and spoke out about the prosecution of Tamara Lich and Chris Barber. We had Dean Allison, I believe, was the first one who broke the ice in the Conservative Party and come out. We had Melissa Lantsman talk about how these people are being treated versus how, say, left-wing protesters in the pro-Palestinian movement are being treated. And in my lunch summary video, I went over how there were 6 people in Ottawa, I believe, who this year had all their charges dropped. These were people charged with mischief-related offenses for various different things. We've had situations in the Ottawa pro-Palestinian protest circuit where pro-Palestinian protesters went to Parliament Hill and took over intersection in front of Parliament Hill on Wellington and made like a shield wall and basically obstructed and occupied the intersection in defiance of riot police. We had a situation in late May this year here in Ottawa at the EY Centre Conference Center at the Ottawa airport that was blockaded by pro-Palestinian demonstrators as some sort of anti-war thing. I believe 13 people were charged in total, 12 in the area for assault and mischief-related offenses, and then a group of them decided to go to the police station for what they like to call jail support, where they were demanding the release of their so-called comrades, and at that location, an additional person, making 13 total, was arrested for cause disturbance. And so the information, if you try to find information on those arrests and those charges, they're practically impossible to find. I do believe they're still there, but knowing the current system we have, I won't be surprised to hear that those get dropped almost immediately. We had, again, earlier this year, 6 of those charges dropped. Meanwhile, again, Chris and Tamara, they want 7 and 8 years for a single mischief conviction, 7 years for Tamara, and a single mischief conviction and a conviction of counseling, disobey a court order not committed for Chris Barber. They want 8 for him. Plus, they want to take his red truck, the work truck that he uses to earn his income, a big part of his family business, and a very important part of the lives of himself and his children. This is not fair. This is not justice. And justice is about parity. When we have 2 groups of protesters being treated dramatically different, that's not fair. So we have this situation in Ottawa. We heard in court today that the cost to the city of Ottawa to police those protests, just here in Ottawa, the pro-Palestinians, was $19 million last year. And I'll come back to this. But I also want to mention that there was another situation just a few days ago on July 19th in Toronto, where there were 11 people arrested for assault police, some for 2 offenses of assault police, obstruct police, mischief, interfere with property. And 1 person was arrested with possession of a prohibited weapon, carry concealed weapon, and as well, I believe he had an obstruct charge. So there was 11 there. And then I believe a 12th person was picked up who was wanted in connection with a MP constituency office that was broken into and vandalized earlier this year. This is incredible, and it shows that we have a very unfair system. And again, without parity, there's no justice. 2-tier justice is not justice. And Pierre Poilievre and the entire Conservative caucus, Melissa Lantsman, Dean Allison, and all the rest of them were correct in calling this out. Andrew Lawton, thanks again. And it's made a difference, I think, and it's totally appropriate. It would have been wrong for them to be silent about this. That's really part of the crux of the issue. The other is the Crown's going on about this great harm they said the convoy caused to Ottawa. Meanwhile, and they're quote, there's a victim impact statement in there where somebody said that it felt like the whole city was under siege. I live in Ottawa. I didn't feel like I was under siege. Chris lived in downtown Ottawa in the core at the time. I don't think you felt like you were under siege, right, Chris?
Not at all.
He said not at all, and the mic's over here. So that's what it is, right? People have difference of opinions. And like I said in my Twitter exchange with the Paul Champ, the lawyer who's actually suing the Convoy organizers for hundreds of millions of dollars, I said, I think it comes down to politics. If you politically agreed with the government punishing the people that disagreed with them and disagreed with your position on the pandemic and COVID and everything, then you disagreed with the Convoy and vice versa. Millions of Canadians who made personal medical decisions were punished by by vaccine mandates, by other public health restrictions. They lost businesses, were separated from loved ones who were dying alone in nursing homes and who did pass away in nursing homes alone. Terrible damage was done to our country. No one has been held to any kind of accountability for that. And it was good to see Diane Magas, when she had her turn coming up after the Crown finished their bloviating, she came up and said, actually, you know, in Ottawa, it was an exceptional circumstance. We saw as the protest traveled across the country that there were people on the sides of the highways, unprecedented support for this protest, a very exceptional circumstance, and that the pandemic hurt some people more than others. And so we could see that support. And we have letters that Chris Barber collected at the time in 2022, calling him a hero. They don't, not a celebrity or a TikTok influencer, but a hero for some people, saying saving their lives and calming and alleviating some of their mental health crisis that the restrictions and never-ending lockdowns were causing on us. And people were protesting in public parks. They were getting arrested. They were getting suppressed, which is entirely illegal. We have rights in our country, and people were protesting in parks and holding signs and getting charged. Kids playing, skating on ponds were being tackled and arrested. You need to remember where this country was at that time. So let me just say, thank God for the Freedom Convoy. And Diane Magas was entirely correct to point out the circumstances surrounding Convoy. 2 years of that oppression, of that government overreach before Convoy rolled into Ottawa. We heard a systemic review of the evidence, right? We know about the citizens of Ottawa. We know Zexi Lee and Stéphane Belfour and all the rest, Paul Jorgensen and Vivian Lear and Chantal Bureau, and how my kid had to, not in particular order, the church person saying that the Led Zeppelin music was too loud, or there's feces here. No sign of who that came from, but Ottawa has a homeless and opiate crisis where people are engaged in constant open drug use in the streets. Me and Chris went for a quick walk last night, and we were attacked by somebody who was having a mental health / drug episode within a minute of walking on Rideau Street. So this is not an unusual thing to see downtown. But during that time, the entirety of downtown was closed, and it was very appropriate that the judge had this follow-up question. The judge, because at one point the Crown was listing off proposed expenses or losses to the businesses and different interest groups, and one of those groups was the Chateau Laurier and the Lord Elgin Hotel, two of the fanciest, most expensive hotels in the city, saying they had damage, they lost revenue, and that they had issues with deliveries and other things. Did you know at that time, and then the judge had a great follow-up for the Crown, which the Crown skated around. The judge asked the Crown, was at that time the hotel open? And the Crown didn't answer that directly. They said, they were getting deliveries, they were starting. No, what was happening in Ontario is the government of Ontario would say, if we reach this level of mitigation, then we'll move to the next stage of opening. And we'd get there and they said, no, that's not enough. We're gonna move it, back and forth for years. Meanwhile, criminalizing protest, throwing letters to MPPs and MPs in the garbage, there was no redress left. Millions of Canadians were subjected to terrible abuse by this system. And I did not deserve to lose out on work opportunities because I refused to take this, this thing that was coming out. All right, I didn't deserve that. I was at no greater risk to anyone who did do it. I was no greater risk to anyone around me. Chris Barber, it's been noted in trial, he did take it, and he was advocating, as noted by his letters of support, for the people that he was meeting. A lot, the people who would come to him as a leader in the community in Swift Current, in Saskatchewan, in the trucking industry, saying, we have no voice here. We've been doing this for years. We're the only people on the road. Everywhere's a ghost town. We're delivering food and keeping the world running during this chaos. But suddenly we're all going to be told that we need to do this or lose our jobs and our livelihoods. And so he was compelled to protest because of that. And we heard amazing points, again, from the Crown, from the defense, the Crown making terrible points, the defense making amazing points. and systemically dismantling the Crown's weak case. The defense started, Magas started by saying the Crown's request for 8 years for Chris Barber is cruel and unusual punishment. And that is an appropriate and necessary statement to be entered into the record of this building, especially when we have constant charges being dropped against pro-Palestinians. And the Crown said, oh, the cost of the city of Ottawa was several $1 million. The cost of the Ottawa police was $55 million or something. And again, that's when Magas was able to, at a later point, reference that the city of Ottawa, the police service of Ottawa, said protesting pro-Palestinian policing cost them $19 million last year. And then the judge asked interesting questions. He said, well, I wonder how much Canada Day costs. I wonder how much it costed when the King visited. How much does any large event cost to police? And in her specific book of authorities, when she was referencing other cases, the G20 was prosecuted as mischief offenses. And in those cases, we had individuals who had bad intentions, who came disguised in black bloc and moving in large groups and did serious damage to police cars. There was glass shards that went towards an officer. There were rocks thrown. There were cars burned to a crisp, and cases of arson and property damage, $2 million of direct property damage, of which the judge admitted today in court we have no such evidence of anything like that in Convoy. So for all your favorite fake news accounts, make sure to mention that to them. Go into my thread on X, find that from the transcript, and send that to your favorite propaganda accounts. And also, the judge said another thing. They said, well, if this was a case relating to something like insurrection, we'd be having a very different conversation, something along those lines. So send all those great tidbits along to your favorite propaganda accounts that don't know what the hell they're talking about. They don't, you know, there's people on there saying that the judge was appointed by Stephen Harper or Justin Trudeau. No, the provincial judges aren't appointed by the Prime Minister of Canada. If you don't even know that, what place do you have to comment on any of this? But nonetheless, right, they're going to do it anyways. And they're going to act like they know what they're doing or what they're talking about. They haven't even spent an hour in there. I've spent hundreds, maybe thousands of hours in there. Many days, it was just me, the accused, the judge, the court officials, and like two people from the mainstream press, like a person from the CBC and sometimes a person from the Canadian press. That's it, and a couple of supporters. That's day 2 to 43. 1 and 45, like the first day, the verdict day, the sentencing, all the Johnny-come-latelys come to swoop in and take the glory. But the long haul of the work, it's a very small list of people. I can tell you I've written extraordinarily extensively and reported on this very thoroughly, and you know that very well. And we heard about all that. Like the civilian witnesses I mentioned earlier talking about their kids got made fun of for walking in a hockey suit. No, they didn't. That would have never happened because they were having games like road hockey games for like a Freedom Cup, right? Like everyone's playing hockey in front of the Supreme Court. Nobody would have made fun of a kid walking in a hockey outfit because his dad parked on Bronson, couldn't remember where, and had to walk a kilometer to get to his highway. And Diane Magas at the time asked him, well, what would you do if you would break down on the highway? And he said, well, I wouldn't, or someone would come get me. So none of this made any, the loud Led Zeppelin music, all that. We've talked about this extensively, the mess in the Signal chats, the PLT relations. And it's interesting because the Crown's theme is they want to have their cake and eat it too. And they're saying, oh, there's no case similar to this. This is unprecedented. Well, just because, first of all, that it's unprecedented doesn't mean it's near the maximum of the possible sentence, because the maximum by law is 10 years. That doesn't mean unprecedented doesn't mean most severe. As well, like Diane Magas said, you can only hold Chris Barber, for the things that he's actually convicted of: mischief and disobey counsel, follow court order, like disobey, ignore court order. And it's important that that doesn't happen. And when you have all these different reports suggesting things like the activities happened at the G20, where people literally testified who were hiding in these stores that were being looted and broken into and burned, that they were fearing for their lives. There was no such situation here. Some people felt scared, but not for the reasons fearing for their lives, like those hiding during the G20 mischief riots did. And the maximum punishment in that entire series of cases was like 21 months. No penitentiary cases for any of those people. And the Crown even admits, and the judge has found, that Tamara and Chris had good intentions. They had like a good intention when they set out to protest. And at some point, the judge said she found that they crossed a line into criminality. I believe she said it crystallized on February 4th. And the Crown has even agreed with that too. But in those cases, in the G20 mischief cases, there was never any good intention. They came disguised to do mischief, to do anarchy, to burn stuff, to do whatever. That's no good intention involved at all from the get-go. And again, $2 million of direct property damage versus a $55 million policing tag for a large event, and protesting costs $20 million a year anyways for protests that people say are illegal. So I don't think that the judge has made it clear, Justice Perkins McVeigh has made it clear that she's not going to put a lot of weight into that price tag. It's more for understanding the context of the situation. So the Crown wants 7 and 8 years for Tamara and Chris respectively. They want to take Chris's truck. They want to punish these people. And I think it's because, and I think we will agree, that it's because they embarrassed and challenged the government. If this was any other, at one point the Crown slipped up and said, there was a discussion of that good faith agreement that happened on the 11th or the 9th, the 11th, and they said, well, if they left at that point, we probably wouldn't be here today. Probably wouldn't be here today. I think the answer is that if they left on the first fucking day, they would have been charged. There would have been charges if there was even a 1-day stint. Doesn't matter. They would have said, oh, you should have never come into town. The goalpost would have always been somewhere else. Oh, you were here? It doesn't matter if it was 3 weeks, 2 weeks, a day, or a minute. They would have charged them because they embarrassed them and they dared to come to Ottawa, the Liberal hegemony, and have their voices heard after 2 years of oppression. They would have been charged regardless. And I think the Crown made it clear in that slip-up. And my goodness, I hope that the judge finds a reasonable outcome here. The judge has said different things. She's a very active judge. She likes to engage in the discussion with both the Crown and the defense. She'll add her thoughts or questions every second or third sentence sometimes. So she's a very, very active listener, and she's very familiar with the evidence. And there was a lot of back and forth, and I've tried to point out some of the more important ones, and I know I missed a lot, but if you're more interested in a lot of the finer details, you can always go to my X threads on Twitter @RightBlend and follow along and read through that huge record of information that I try. And these are paraphrases, not exact quotes, but they get you a very good idea of what was said and how it was going down. There's some sections that I do skip. There's some times where I'm just summarizing the ideas of what was said, but you get the gist. There's a lot more details there. And those impact statements and everything, and I believe that Tamara Lich, actually, her lawyers, Lawrence Greenspun and Eric Granger, tomorrow will be challenging not the fact that the victim's statements are included, but the scope of them or what they're saying. Like some of them are suggesting things like the G20 happened, and the judge herself said there's no evidence of that here. Just like she said, if this was an insurrection-related incident, we'd be talking a different conversation. I don't think they're going to get anywhere near. And again, the Crown constantly quoting Justice Mosley when he said in federal court that in Canadian Frontline Nurses that the convoy it was an unacceptable breakdown of public order, but failing to mention again that he also found that the freezing of the bank accounts and the Emergencies Act invocation was ultra vires. And of course, they skipped over that part, but then said, oh, it's under appeal. So they'll take the pieces that they like, and then no case is at parity with this. There's no case in Canadian law the same as this. Bulk hockey. In the Superior Court of Justice, which is a higher court than this court upstairs, that's where Pat King had his trial. He was convicted of 5 charges by Justice Hackland, and that decision is binding on this court. And the scenario is very close because that court found that Mr. King was a very prevalent social media influencer, which is the basis of the evidence of this case and the circumstances of the counseling of this case. When Mr. Barber went to an intersection and joked that it looked lonely. That's literally the basis of his conviction for counsel to disobey court order. And so they found that Pat King was a social media influencer, that he was on the periphery of leadership. And again, 5 convictions versus the 3 combined between Chris and Tamara. And he got sentenced to 9 months time served credit for his pre-custody time, and then also a 3-month house arrest, which is a conditional sentence. So if the judge here issues any more, I don't see how that's not binding on her in this decision. And the judge was really interested in case law relating to counseling disobey a court order. And Diane Magas pulled up something about Elizabeth May, who is an MP. And Elizabeth May was found guilty of criminal contempt for basically counseling people to disobey a court order. And her punishment was a $1,500 fine. I think originally it was $500, but the judge said, no, Miss Elizabeth May is a lawyer. She's a member of parliament. She has all these extra responsibilities and knowledge. So her fine should be higher. And that's what she got. So Mr. Barber is not a lawyer. And so should he get a more significant punishment than that? And we've already seen mischief cases all over. The Crown will take from Coutts when they like and then disregard it when they don't like it. Today they said Coutts has nothing in common with Ottawa. That was a road. This was a downtown core. Well, meanwhile, and it only lasted an X period of time, but actually Coutts lasted quite a few weeks. And the mischief findings in the case of Marco van Hugevos are extremely informative for this case. In fact, Mr. Hackland used them in Mr. King's verdict, in his findings there. So definitely that's going to end up in the decision at some point here. And it's just a big game of politics. If it wasn't for the politics, if it wasn't for the federal government being embarrassed, I don't see how we would have ever ended up here. I really don't. The Crown said, oh, if it was one day, it's not about the politics, the Crown said, it's about the means. It's also about parity. Other protesters who fight with police in riot gear in Toronto, in Ottawa, whatever, show up with helmets and beat on police and form lines and riot. basically, and break into MPs' offices and into Parliament Hill on Confederation Building. They are treated with kid gloves, have their charges dropped, and are not prosecuted like this. But Convoy protesters are chased to the ends of the world, and certainly Chris and Tamara, in listing off the deterrence that Mr. Barber has already experienced. Diane Magas said that he spent $40,000 traveling to Ottawa, that he had a $100,000 bond, which is extraordinarily high, that he spent 2 days in, 2 lawyer days in jail, and that obviously it's been 3 years and 5 months since his arrest, since his charges. And she said the Supreme Court of Canada has found that even if someone is not going to make a challenge of their rights on a charter basis, that doesn't rise to the basis of a charter violation, that they could still argue that a charter issue should be considered in a lower sentence. And in this case, the delay. The defense argues that a lot of the delays in this case, which was scheduled to take 10 days, took 45 plus, were due to things that weren't at the feet of the defense. Within 2 weeks of the start of this trial, they were served with the Carter motion by the Crown, which is a huge change of the game plan. And this happened again and again. There was the signal chats that came up later during the trial with Sear and Botch. And they're like, well, that's not disclosed. We need that. So this happened again and again and again. There was endless legal arguments. The judge herself said that both sides were given the opportunity to present the legal arguments they felt were necessary. And this is making her case as tight as she can. There's certainly going to be appeals from the Crown, 100% they will. They're going to appeal all the acquittals and certainly the sentence, whatever it is, it's not going to be enough for them. But this is where it is, and it's political. It's not the politics, it's the means. No, it's the politics, because people with different politics and more extreme means are treated far better, right? So how can we draw any other comparison? I'm so happy that the Conservatives called this out, and I'm glad that this is moving at the pace it is, that we got through the Crown's submissions for the sentencing hearing, that we got through Diane Magas. Tomorrow by lunch, Mr. Granger and Mr. Greenspun think that they'll be done, and then we'll have the Crown response, and then probably by the middle of August, we'll have the actual sentencing, and I'm really hoping that it's not severe. The Diane Magas is asking for a discharge, which would mean that Mr. Barber would not receive a criminal record, and I believe that's within the realm of appropriate. And if that's not enough, she said, okay, a suspended sentence without parole and without probation, and if Her Honor deems it absolutely necessary to have a criminal record, then a conditional sentence to be served in the community, because he meets all the conditions. He's been on bail for 3.5 years with no danger to the public, extraordinarily pro-social. And I think, you know what, we've been going on and on here, and there's so much more to say, but I'll finish it up with this. Chris Barber has such a good character that his ex's family came out to write glowing letters of support. Reading portions of his ex-wife's letter to the court, Diane Magas, it was incredible. She was saying he's the kind of guy who learns from his mistakes. He's grown extremely wise over the years, that she respects him tremendously, that he's always going out of his way to help other people, that he advocates for his trucker community. Her new husband wrote a letter. His name is Dave Wall. He is the nephew, I believe, of former Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall. That's the relation there. And the judge wasn't extraordinarily interested in that. She did want to know, like, how many employees Chris employs, like how many regular, how many contract. He has 5 to 8 regular employees and 2 contract employees at his trucking business in Saskatchewan, Chris Barber. And these letter from Dave was like, yeah, he's great. And the reason he went to Ottawa, I really hope, Your Honor, in your sentencing, you can consider his great character and the reasons he went to Ottawa and the circumstances of that, and his role in the trucking community and what he was being told by other truckers without a voice, and where he decided to stand up. And Diane Magas raised the point that Mr. Barber has a very low moral blameworthiness in this, which is very important for the sentencing. He did everything he could. He communicated with police. He communicated with lawyers. He sought legal advice, even though it was not necessarily the correct legal advice. He made the effort to seek it, which shows his intentions. He worked with the PLTs to move the truck. It was Inspector Russell Lucas of the Ottawa Police who said that it wasn't his fault, that it wasn't because of his lack of effort that the deal fell apart. It was Ottawa Police Command who did that. And this was also repeated by former Director of Emergency Management and Preparedness, Kim Ayotte, for the City of Ottawa, who sent a text message apologizing to Barber. And the judge raised the point, well, they could have just left. But Barber did what he could to run this, to participate in this protest and instruct the people who would listen to him to do it in the best way he can. Like when he said, if you get arrested, put your hands behind your back and do it and take it like a man. And he led by example with that. The judge was like, well, that's why I didn't find him guilty of obstruction or counseling obstruction. But I think it goes to the grand context of the circumstances. It shows that he tried his very best. He's not learned in law, but he received legal advice that maybe some of the things the police were doing were wrong and that he had a right to be there. And he was trying to be on the right side of this. He was in communication with police the entirety of the way, from Swift Current through every police force all the way to Ottawa. They were escorted in, up Carling, up Pinecrest, Carling, all the way up until they got to Wellington. That's where they wanted to be. And they agreed. Like Russell Lucas, I think it was the one who said, well, I understand why they want to be in Wellington. The Crown acted so surprised. Why are they in Ottawa? And it was funny when Magas said, well, the Crown's asking why Ottawa, it's a capital city. Well, exactly, it's a capital city. That's where people come to protest, especially federal mandates, right? It's one of those things. It's just, duh, like, it doesn't make it worse. And the Crown's also seemingly trying to argue that the fact that Chris and Tamara tried to work with the police liaison teams makes them more morally culpable, that it's worse, it's an aggravating factor or something. No, it's not. They tried to do their best. Like, the fact that they talked to them isn't against them. It's in favor of them, I think. I think any reasonable person would agree. They weren't there they were trying. They were trying. This was an intolerable situation in our country. You know that. And I'm so happy that they did this. And they are heroes. They really are. And they need to be given an appropriate sentence, which is little to none. Little to none. Yeah. Oh, there's also the idea. Yeah, I have to finish this, guys. We're long here. We'll be better tomorrow. But thanks again for tuning in and for following all these years. If you want to support this work, consider sending an e-transfer to realrightblend@gmail.com. Chris Stacey behind the camera from Ottawa. Thank you.